So now we're back to item 1 and 2. So these are the two items deferred from June. And first being teaching resources for English language arts, which is the Curriculum Associates product, IReady. And in it, yes, sorry for that. So this is our supplemental resource for reading and English language arts. And the board received a report on June 30th, which responded and provided a lot of detail to the questions we had at the June meeting. And in addition, would just like to add that for this vendor, for this contract, we considered 13 other vendors, and we ended up ranking 2 at the top, and we are recommending to you the least costly proposal. And as Christine Byers mentioned initially, this was first approved by the board in 2014 and has been gradually phased in over that period of time. And we are ready to answer any other questions that you have. Now, do you want me to?
Yes, I had submitted
I think,
questions regarding usage data and a few others.
I think that we're just going to have Dr. Boswell McComas address the questions, and I'm certainly happy to pitch in as needed.
Hi.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi again. Good afternoon. So in terms of your usage questions, we, on Friday afternoon, when we received your list of questions, we reached out to the vendors. We are in the process of collecting some of that data from one of the vendors. IReady has provided us all of the data in spreadsheets with the exception of, I forget which number. I think it was number 8, perhaps. Those spreadsheets are pretty extensive. I went to print them out, and one was 65 pages, another one was 32 pages. And so I know I confer with Ms. White on what would be the best way to relay that information to you, because it's clearly more than me sitting here going through table by table, month by month. So to that end, we said that we would send that in the Friday update. Is that?
A link to it if those analytics are preferred. We can send the link to that type of information. The analytics are extensive. I guess the deeper question, though, would be to get to the heart of your question and to make sure that we're understanding your question, the analytics that you're seeking to answer which question? What, are you looking for usage just for the sake of usage, or are you looking for usage just to see the frequency?
The frequency, the distribution of use throughout schools, to evaluate the total cost per student, to understand really how these tools are being used, because they are large items.
Well, certainly, we can most likely then summarize that information instead of just providing the board with spreadsheets that may not get to that point. Would be able to summarize that for you and provide that to you in the Friday letter.
Okay. Moving on, some of your other questions pertain to alternate programs that were considered. I know Mr. Saris just spoke to the number of other programs that were reviewed, and that was also included in the Friday message last week.
Ms. Haddon, you seem to have some other, did you have other questions?
I did, that I submitted regarding, first, the overview of the process for evaluating these programs, given that new tools are constantly entering the market. Are we looking at them annually, and if so, how and by whom?
Yes, so we opened with sharing that process. We follow the process as outlined in policy and rule 6002, and that is the process that we hold to. Typically, as contracts move forward, they follow that process throughout. In terms of, we don't just go out and grab something and then pull it in without following that process.
Of course, I'm interested in, because new products, particularly with technology, are constantly being introduced.
Yes.
And are competing with perhaps some tools that we're already using. Are we looking at those options in terms of lowest cost and benefits? I would be interested in seeing a side-by-side comparison of what those options are, because I've heard from stakeholders that lower cost tools exist that they have been very pleased with. So given equal outcomes, if we make that assumption, are we looking at all
That's
of the
exactly, and
options?
I'm sorry, Dr. McComas, that's exactly what we take a look at. So we, and before the contracts committee started, and we'll do the same thing for the full board, we went through the kind of the vetting process for instructional materials. We believe that the board would be interested in just that kind of reminder, and for the full public as well, that type of sharing of information. We do steep all of our processes in policy, and so that's connected to policy 6002. In terms of the vetting process, we make sure that there are multiple stakeholders included. We do that side-by-side comparison, not only for instructional quality, but for cost comparisons as well. And then we only submit those that are, that have that instructional value and that also have a great cost benefit as well. So cost is not the primary concern. We want to make sure that we're meeting the instructional needs of students first. So it's based on those academic needs that need to be addressed. Once we find those products, then we submit those to curriculum committee so they can vet the content, the alignment to standards, and the alignment to students' academic needs. That is a fully vetted process. That is that step-by-step process we do follow. That's according to Board of Education Policy 6002 and Superintendent's Rule as well. So I just want to make sure that the board understands that those processes are not skirted, or we don't work outside of that process. We make sure that teachers are involved, that principals are involved as well as the experts in curriculum as well.
Sure. Thank you for that explanation. And some of that information that is shared in curriculum committee would be useful to this committee, because we are ultimately reviewing these contracts, and it's helpful to have that context and background when we're evaluating.
One of the things, and just for the board and the public's consideration as well, staff will be looking at these contract exhibits so that they'll be breaking those exhibits into the what, why, how format. So what is it, why do we believe that we need this material, whatever it is, and then how we're planning to implement. That will give you a summary of what's happened at curriculum committee and what had been vetted, and it will also give us an ease and flow of information and transparency from one committee to the next. So you'll have that information.
Very good. Thank you.
And I would also support what Ms. Henn, the notion that she's presenting, that we develop between staff and the board the most efficient way to evaluate, because I think we're bumping our heads at sometimes and being redundant, and I'm sure we can come up with a very more efficient way to vet these
Absolutely.
between the two committees.
And it sounds like there's a rigorous process in place. What I'm asking for is greater transparency to the board to understand that process, and perhaps a lot of our questions would be answered if we knew that those were already being addressed, which is our only interest.
Absolutely.
Good, very good. Thank you. Ms. Causey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I understand from the presentation that we had at the beginning of our contract committee meeting about staff following policy and Rule 6002 and making vetted choices. However, in technology areas, these are new software, new ways of doing things. And sometimes we can make a choice, even though it's carefully done, and it still not be the best choice or work out the way that we want for our students and for our teachers, giving them the resources that they need. So in my mind, we not only need to do that careful process of selection, but also in evaluating the impacts. So I did look over the information that we received from Kevin Smith, thank you very much, last week about the IReady, and honestly, I felt the data was thin. So I had a couple questions about that. There's MAP data that's averaged across 3 grades for achievement data from the pilot that's related to IReady. And it doesn't indicate which window of growth is presented. There's fall to winter, there's winter to spring, spring to summer, which we don't normally do, I understand, because our students do the park after grade 3. Is that correct for the map. And then also some of the data was in percentages and some was in the raw numbers. And if you break that down into percentages, it's a really very small percentage. So for instance, on page 5, 2% more kids in the IReady pilot met or exceeded their growth target than would have been expected on basis of district as a whole. So I'm not sure that that's statistically significant when we're talking about an additional $1 million, and that if we continue expanding this contract, this system-wide, that it's going to be financially sustainable versus some other interventions that could take place. Another aspect of the data that we were given is I understand that NWEA changed the norms in 2015. And so they redid that. I guess the population in our country, our kindergarten readiness is going down. And anyway, it makes it difficult to compare 2014-15 school year to 2015-2016. So again, I just don't feel that the board has been presented with significant results to justify the cost. There's, as Ms. Henn suggested, there are other things that are out there, and perhaps not just saying this is what we're doing that's working and here's how much it costs, but there's other school districts having success with other things. And I did also want to acknowledge the input that the board has received through emails, phone calls, and other methods, but it's not appropriate in my mind for central office staff to put teachers on the spot to ask for support in contracts. I think that is, number one, it puts them on the spot, and number two, then anyone that had anything that was not rosy would hold those comments to themselves. And rather what we need is to have board-directed, superintendent-guided, anonymous gathering of information so that we can see the impact on a whole in an objective fashion, not in a solicited manner. And I also think that given the high school students, when we get the software to that location, they can have their own input. But I had also submitted questions about, that were given by a stakeholder, and actually several more have come in, about the dyslexia with decoding, about specifically IReady not having a specific component of a balanced literacy approach, and I wonder if you could address that.
Right, so IReady does serve as a universal screening, and so it is not itself designed to serve dyslexic students. What it does is it helps us universally identify where students may be struggling. As we work with students who are struggling, it then allows us to further dig deeper into where that student is struggling, and then we begin to apply other resources that help us. Basically, it becomes an entry to our awareness that a student may need more significant supports, and whether that's Orton Gillingham or other supports along the way. So again, I ask that you understand that this is not a tool specifically designed for students who have been identified as having dyslexia. This is a tool that's designed to help us recognize where students are struggling, and then from that point on, we as professional educators work with the student to see, do we need to do further screening, and what other tiers of resources of support. IReady functions as part of a multi-tiered systems of support for students. So this would really, if you think about a universal, I'm not sure how familiar you are with response and intervention models, but it serves as an initial threshold for us to gauge who may need a closer examination of what their diagnostic needs are, and then what resources align to those needs that may be more explicit instruction.
So along those lines, I would just like to add, Dr. McComas is absolutely right. So in terms of that warning system, where there's a flagging system to say there may be an issue here, that supports the teacher in that way, in terms of having that warning system. It's also an instructional tool. Now, remember that no tool replaces a teacher. There's no tool that can replace the classroom teacher. But our classroom teachers need tools to work with. So in terms of this tool and Dreambox as well, it's not only an intervention tool, but it can serve as an instructional tool with being another pair of hands for that teacher. In terms of the growth, just keep in mind, we're talking about a full year's growth in a half year's time. So those results, we believe, were pretty impressive in order to bring it back or to make sure that we had this extension. I think it's important for us to keep in mind that if we don't select a tool such as this, one that is adaptive and flexible, we will be bringing forward multiple consumable kinds of items. Those consumable costs will be extensive and will be pretty costly for the system. It will also require our teachers to have a diagnostic tool. That will be one. They will have to get familiar with another instructional tool. That's another. They will have to have another tool or resource for small group instruction. So it's not that we can't have other resources. We will have to reach out for multiple resources where this one is adaptive and flexible in one. And Dreambox, very, very similar product. So I just wanted to put that out there because I'm not sure if that was explained fully in the last presentation. Just want to make sure that we have an understanding that this is not only an evaluation or diagnostic type of a tool, but it can serve as another set of pair of hands for teachers as an instructional tool as well.
If I could at this point, I think there are a lot of questions that remain on Dreambox and even the IReady, and since we have reached the end of the time allotted for building and contracts, I'm going to suggest that we discuss these two in front of the whole board without a recommendation from the Building and Contracts Committee on these two, to give ourselves, so we don't have to rush through the discussion and delay our oral arguments and things that we have scheduled later in the afternoon. Yes.
I would move that our recommendation be to delay vote on this until the data that was provided can be reviewed by this
yeah.
committee and by the full board.
We can make that recommendation.
That's my recommendation.
But again, the full board is going to ultimately decide, but we can,
Then this committee can make that recommendation, is that correct?
well, you can, if you want to make a motion and see if our committee would support that.
I move that the recommendation of this committee be to delay votes on IReady and Dreambox.
All right, is there a
For the full
second
board.
to that?
I'll second that because I have a question regarding it.
And I also want to indicate that I'm going to vote no on that recommendation, but I would like to hear about the import of doing so by the system.
All right.
Before we actually do that.
And if I could continue on that just briefly, the Department of Ed, Office of Ed Technology, has developed a really great model for evaluating ed tech products that I've shared with Ms. White and plan to share with central staff that I'd like to see us move towards, because I think it brings an evidence-based way for the board to more easily evaluate these contracts when they come before us. And the reason why I requested the usage data is because their recommendation is to look at usage data first before we even begin to look at outcomes. And it's a very structured approach. So that's what led me to ask those questions and why I'd like to see the data.
And what I'm saying is I'd like to know how that kind of affects our timing and the modification, because this is a modification. The underlying contract still remains in force, and the question will still be for this board, how do we evaluate on an ongoing basis programs like this? And can we pilot, is there any prohibition in the underlying contract to piloting other programs like System 44, Read 180, and so on? So it's a larger discussion than just that is my point.
All right, and again, just so we can stay on track, we have a motion and a second. Is there further discussion? You have a...
Yes, I would like to have the superintendent give us information that would let us know whether that's possible or what timeframe. In last year, for instance, we had a contract that did not go through, and we needed to have an emergency meeting to get a new contract for leased facilities for some of our students that were moving. So I would offer that there's an opportunity where we could have another meeting if there is a deadline that the system needs for us to make a decision. So not to just decide to delay it, but to understand what are the ramifications to the system. Because I would even suggest that because what I don't want to do is disrupt teachers and students. We have had a tremendous number of initiatives come through in the last 4 to 5 years, and these are federal level, state level, county decisions and so on. So if there's a possibility of maybe continuing who has it and then having a more robust evaluation of the impacts and better input community-wide, then maybe we could maintain the status quo for who's using it now. But those things would be dependent on how long do these contracts actually have before our system is no longer able to use them.
So I would say that there would be a significant impact to the classroom. And so we want to make sure, certainly we do evaluate our products and we do evaluate our services, and there's a process for doing so. I would say that to get a new product or products in place would take at least a year or two, because the board's desire would be to have them piloted. These programs have been piloted and have been proven. So in order for us to move forward with a recommendation for another, for other products, certainly you would want them to be piloted as well. We would have to be able to have that selection. We would have to produce staff development and training for teachers on whatever those new products are. And that's all, before we get to the professional development, we would need to follow our own processes that are steeped in policy and rule in the vetting processes for instructional materials. So we would really be starting kind of at square one with selecting the new products and services. And again, I would assume that we're talking about multiple, because again, this adaptive approach gives us multiple products in one. But we would have to go back to the drawing board, start over again with the selection process. It's not that it's impossible. It can be done, but there may be a gap for teachers. So in the meantime, we would have to provide that type of communication to our teachers to let them know that this tool may or may not be available to them. Now, you can talk about the
But I think,
extent of the timeline.
let's just see if our motion
If
can
that's
move
the
forward.
case, then what is our exit strategy for pilots that do not meet our expectations?
Yes, we do have a full process that we use through research accountability and assessment. We have turned off, if you will, programs that we find to be, that are not giving us the academic benefit or the return on our investment that we've anticipated. So we have turned off products, and we have dismissed other kinds of contracts or discontinued contracts that were not giving us that return on investment.
So there's precedent for having a gap then?
Absolutely. Well, there's not a precedent for having a gap. What we do is when we find that we have that, that we're not seeing the performance that we've expected, then we look at that selection process. We get that in place prior to turning off one and beginning another.
Okay.
So that
Again-
we have the
again, we have a-
overlap that we
We
need.
have a motion, we've had some discussion. Those in favor of Ms. Henn's motion to delay the recommendation or proceed on IReady, please say aye.
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 Those opposed? So we're going to bring it forth with no recommendation from the Building and Contracts Committee. Could I ask on items 3 through 16, which we went through, if the members here would be in favor of bringing them forth, recommending that they move forth to the full board? All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
I would say aye, except M9.
Okay, well, we'll note that in our recommendation, and we won't make any recommendation on items 1 and 2. At this time, we'll end our Building and Contracts meeting. We thank you very much for the information provided.